All right, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be kind of unpacking a really interesting story in tech history, and it's something that you've probably heard of, but maybe never fully understood.
Yeah.
And that's Apple's Newton.
Yeah, the Newton.
Now, for those of you who are fans of the show, you like to get smart on a topic. Real quick, think of this as your shortcut to understanding the significance and maybe even more importantly the stumbles of this early step in mobile computing.
Right.
So we've got a great piece of source material for this, and that is Apple's Newton, the handheld that was ahead of its time but doomed to fail. And that's from Cognitive Market Research by Sneha Mali.
That's right.
So yeah, really interesting deep dive. I think what we're really trying to figure out today is, why the Newton, even with, the Apple name behind it and some seriously forward-thinking ideas, why didn't it stick?
Yeah.
And maybe even more importantly, what we can learn from it. So let's jump right in. Apple's move to develop the Newton in the late 80s, it seems like it was driven by a really bold vision, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Apple, was already, a huge force in desktop computers and, they saw the Newton as the next logical step, right? This, personal electronic notepad that you could use to organize your life and, most importantly, input information through handwriting recognition.
Right.
It was spearheaded by their advanced technology group, which, right away tells you it was experimental and, exploring new frontiers.
Yeah, they were really, not just was the idea itself ambitious, they were really pushing the limits of what was possible technologically.
Right.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that piece that we looked at highlights their use of the ARM processor.
Right.
I mean, we hear that name everywhere now, but back then,
Right.
like that was a huge gamble.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it really foreshadowed, as Molly's research points out, it really foreshadowed the, fundamental role that the ARM architecture would play in all of Apple's future mobile devices,
Right.
from the iPhone to the iPad.
Right.
So, I mean, really kind of an early bet that shows just how, innovative the spirit behind the Newton was.
Yeah.
However, this very desire to be on the cutting edge is also where they encountered some pretty, significant challenges, particularly with that headline feature, right? The handwriting recognition.
Right. The handwriting recognition was so heavily marketed as like the key differentiator.
Right.
The thing that was going to make it indispensable. But it sounds like the reality didn't quite match the promise.
Right. Well, I mean, think about it. You're promised this, natural, intuitive way to just jot down your notes and organize your thoughts, and then it's constantly misinterpreting what you wrote.
Yeah.
And that's bound to lead to some, pretty frustrating experiences for those early adopters.
Yeah.
And those negative reviews, they really did undermine its initial appeal. So, even groundbreaking technology, if it doesn't deliver a positive and reliable user experience, it's going to struggle.
Yeah.
It's going to struggle to gain any traction.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the software that was letting people down.
Right.
The research also points to some other pretty significant technological hurdles.
Yeah.
The price, for one, it was quite steep.
Yeah, it was, significantly more expensive than other personal digital assistants, or PDAs as they were known back then.
Right.
And that higher cost created a real barrier, for a lot of people who may have been interested.
Yeah. And then there was the design.
Right.
You think of Apple later on, you think of like sleek and elegant, but bulky seems to be the word that comes up a lot.
Yeah, I know.
When you're describing the Newton.
It lacked that, refined user-friendly design language that would later, really become such a hallmark of Apple products.
Yeah.
And beyond just the physical appearance, the internal hardware itself was also, somewhat underpowered for all these, tasks that it was trying to handle.
Right.
And that led to sluggish performance and poor battery life, which is, not exactly what you want when you're on the go.
Yeah, particularly for a portable device, right?
Exactly.
Also in a world that was really starting to see the potential of being connected. The internet was just starting to really emerge. The Newton was missing some pretty fundamental features.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it lacked wireless connectivity and a robust app ecosystem, both features that I think you probably take for granted in your devices today.
Yeah, of course.
But that was a huge, limitation for the Newton. It really kind of existed in its own little technological bubble, unable to, connect with these other emerging technologies and really, expand its functionality through software.
Yeah, so the technology itself presented some pretty major obstacles. But the piece that we read also really gets into how the way the Newton was marketed,
Hmm.
actually contributed to its struggles as well.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just a tech problem.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, Apple had, these grand aspirations for the Newton, but the marketing efforts didn't effectively communicate that vision
Right.
to the average consumer.
Yeah. Did it feel to you like they were focused more on like the technical specs,
Yeah.
especially that handwriting recognition,
Yeah.
but not so much the why?
Right. Like, why should I actually spend, a significant amount of money on this?
Yeah.
What's in it for me?
Yeah.
It's very unclear.
Yeah. And that high price tag, in what was still a pre-new and uncertain market
Right.
for PDAs, people weren't even really sure what these devices were for.
Right.
And the Newton was asking them to make a pretty significant investment.
Exactly. I mean, and, in a way, the Newton's failure created a bit of a paradox for Apple because they had cultivated this image as this, leading innovator.
Yeah.
But the Newton, left many customers feeling underwhelmed or, perhaps even questioning that reputation,
Right.
at least within the specific category.
Yeah. Okay. So the Newton, it didn't achieve mainstream success. We know that.
Right.
But the research that we looked at makes a really interesting point that it played a crucial role in Apple's long-term success.
Yeah.
How do you see that? Because it seems a little counterintuitive.
Well, what's fascinating to me is that even products that don't succeed in the marketplace, right, they can provide these incredibly valuable learning experiences
Right.
for companies.
Yeah.
And the Newton Project allowed Apple to, really kind of hone and refine its approach to mobile technology.
Yeah.
Right? They got to experiment. They got to see, firsthand what resonated with users and perhaps even more importantly, what didn't.
Right.
And, that iterative process of learning from both successes and failures is so critical in innovation.
Yeah. And going back to that ARM processor,
Right.
it wasn't just a minor detail.
Oh, no, it was huge.
Yeah, the research really emphasizes its significance.
Yeah.
The fact that the Newton was one of the very first devices to incorporate the ARM architecture, directly links it to those powerful and energy-efficient processors.
Right. That now power billions of Apple devices, including the iPhone and iPad that you're probably using right now.
Right. Yeah.
To listen to this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty significant and often overlooked connection.
Yeah.
You can almost think of it like, choosing a revolutionary engine for a new type of vehicle.
Yeah.
It has this immense potential, but the support infrastructure and, the understanding of how to best utilize it is still in its infancy.
Right.
So, it takes time.
And it wasn't just the hardware breakthroughs, was it? I mean, the software team's efforts, they apparently laid some important groundwork as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the focus on developing user-friendly interfaces and, intuitive design, even in, its early and somewhat clunky form with the Newton, it really was a precursor to the design principles that would later define Apple's most successful and beloved products.
Yeah.
So you can really see those early seeds of their, future design philosophy being sown with the Newton software.
Yeah, the piece also mentions how the Newton's journey really influenced Apple's subsequent approach to the personal assistant market,
Right.
Siri and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really kind of hammered home for them, I think, the importance of, controlling the entire user experience, right? Having the hardware and the software working seamlessly together.
Right.
And that philosophy has been absolutely central to their success with later mobile devices.
Yeah.
And of course, core concepts like touchscreens and, the idea of a personal digital assistant, which were first explored in the Newton. They were eventually revisited and refined and implemented so successfully in later Apple products.
Yeah. So even though the Newton itself didn't become a household name, its influence clearly had this ripple effect within Apple.
Right.
But what about its impact on the broader PDA and mobile computing market? I mean, did it just kind of disappear as if it never happened?
Not at all. I mean, the Newton's journey, including its stumbles and its shortcomings, it served as a really crucial learning experience for the entire tech industry. I mean, it clearly demonstrated the potential of these handheld devices to fundamentally change how people interact with personal computing.
Yeah, and those features that the Newton pioneered, like using a stylus for input and having a touch screen, they didn't just vanish into thin air, did they?
No, exactly. Many of those core features that were introduced with the Newton, including stylus input, touchscreen technology, even the fundamental concept of digital note-taking, they were adopted and significantly improved upon by other companies in the PDA market and eventually the smartphones that followed.
Right. So in a way, the Newton's failures actually helped to steer the direction of mobile computing,
Yeah.
really kind of highlighting, how important reliability and a positive user experience are.
Absolutely. Those lessons that were learned from the Newton's challenges, they directly contributed to the development of those, more functional and user-friendly PDAs, and ultimately the smartphones that you and so many others rely on so heavily today.
Right.
So, it really did pave the way for Apple's eventual dominance in the mobile market by really underscoring that, essential blend of elegant design and powerful, reliable functionality.
Right. And that brings us to one of the key takeaways from the research, which is that despite, the Newton's lack of commercial success, it laid this crucial groundwork for Apple's, future mobile triumphs.
Yeah.
It was one of the early devices powered by ARM technology, and it really influenced the development of touchscreen and stylus-based interfaces.
Right.
It's a pretty powerful idea to consider.
It really is. I mean, it shows how, even products that don't achieve their initial goals, they
Okay.
can leave a lasting and very significant impact on the trajectory of technology.
So to wrap up our deep dive into the Apple Newton,
Yeah.
it was undeniably an ambitious piece of technology packed with groundbreaking ideas for its time.
Hmm.
But ultimately, it was held back by the technological limitations that existed then
Yeah.
and perhaps some miscalculations in how it was presented to the public.
Right.
Um, but it's so important to remember that even these so-called failures can provide incredibly valuable insights and lessons.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And the Newton story is a perfect illustration of how those lessons can build a crucial foundation for
Mhm.
future success. And, we've clearly seen that play out in Apple's subsequent journey
Right.
in the mobile technology market.
Yeah. So on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider as you go about your day. Reflecting on the story of the Apple Newton, what current technological endeavors do you observe that might be ahead of their time right now?
Mm.
What key factors do you think will ultimately determine whether they achieve widespread success or ultimately stumble?
It's a fascinating question about navigating that tricky balance between, truly radical innovation and, practical feasibility
Right.
for the consumer.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh. All right, well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us,
Of course, my pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
See you then.
Okay.
Bye.